She is the disgrace of this family. The words did not echo like a shout. They landed heavier than that, sharper, cleaner, and somehow more permanent, as if they had been engraved into the air rather than spoken at a wedding. I remember standing near the edge of the reception hall, holding a glass of untouched water, watching people react in ways they thought were subtle but were not. A few guests froze mid-conversation. A few others pretended not to hear. But everyone heard. That was the strange thing about moments like this. They do not need repetition to become real. My father stood at the center of it all, his posture rigid, his expression controlled in the way he always used when he believed he was right. My mother stood slightly behind him, her hands clasped together, eyes lowered, as if looking down could somehow soften what had already been said. And my sister, Sophie, in her wedding dress, stood between celebration and silence, her smile no longer matching the room she was in. I did not move at first. Not because I was calm, but because I had learned over the years that movement in moments like this often gave others permission to define your reaction before you understood it yourself. So I stayed still, just long enough to feel the weight of every gaze that briefly passed over me and then decided not to stay. I was not the bride. I was not part of the ceremony. And in that moment, I was also not part of the family table that had been arranged only a few feet away. I stepped slightly backward, not dramatically, not in protest, but in recognition. There is a difference between being pushed out and realizing you were already standing outside the circle before anyone acknowledged it. He heard my father again, this time speaking lower, as if lowering his voice could soften the impact of what he had already released into the room. But the damage was not in volume. It was in certainty. That word, disgrace, does not invite discussion. It closes it. My mother finally looked at me, just for a second. There was something in her eyes that I had seen many times before in my life, something between apology and hesitation, but it never stayed long enough to become action. She looked away again almost immediately, returning to the role she always chose when conflict arrived too publicly to resolve privately. Sophie turned her head slightly toward me, her expression conflicted, caught between the day she had planned and the moment she was now forced to share it with me. I did not blame her for that expression. Weddings are not designed for interruption, especially not emotional ones that do not fit the schedule. I took another step back, slowly moving away from the center of the hall. No one stopped me. No one called my name in a way that suggested urgency. That silence told me more than the words had. Because sometimes exclusion does not need force. It only needs agreement. And agreement, once formed in silence, becomes very difficult to challenge in public. As I reached the side of the room where the lighting softened and the noise became less structured, I felt my phone vibrate in my hand. I almost ignored it. Almost. But something about the timing, about the way everything around me had already shifted without warning, made me look down. There was one message. No context. No greeting. Used information that did not belong to the moment I was standing in, but somehow controlled it anyway. I read it once, then again, not because I did not understand it, but because I understood it too clearly. And in that quiet space between what had just been said out loud and what had just been said privately, I realized something that changed the weight of everything in front of me. The story they were telling in this room was not the only version of what was happening. I stayed near the side of the reception hall long after I read the message on my phone, not moving back into the center, not leaving either. It was as if the space I occupied no longer required participation, only presence. Around me, the wedding continued in fragments. Conversations tried to restart themselves. Glasses were lifted and set down. Someone laughed too loudly at something that was no longer funny. But the energy of the room had changed shape. It was no longer a celebration that included me. It was a structure adjusting around my removal. I looked down at my phone again, reading the message a third time, not because the words changed, but because my understanding of them was still catching up to what had just happened in front of me. The message was simple, almost disturbingly so, like it did not belong to the emotional weight of the moment I was standing in. It referenced names, details, and a timeline that did not align with what my father had just declared in front of everyone. For a moment, I considered the possibility that I had misunderstood it. That misunderstanding requires ambiguity, and there was none. It was precise. That precision made everything else in the room feel less stable. I lifted my gaze slowly and looked back toward the center of the hall. My father was still there, speaking now in smaller circles, as if the earlier moment had been absorbed into the background of the event rather than remaining its center. My mother stood beside him again, her expression carefully neutral, performing the familiar role of calming presence without actually engaging with what had just happened. Sophia was being guided gently by one of the bridesmaids toward another group of guests, her wedding continuing around the disruption instead of stopping for it. He realized then how quickly a moment can be absorbed by a system that refuses to pause for contradiction. He started walking slowly, not toward the exit, but toward a quieter corner near the hallway that led to the back rooms. No one followed me. No one stopped me. That absence of interruption felt intentional rather than accidental. He leaned slightly against the wall and looked at the message again, this time focusing not on what it said, but on what it implied. If what I was reading was accurate, then the version of events unfolding in the hall was incomplete. Not slightly incorrect, not misunderstood, but fundamentally partial. And in that gap between partial truth and public certainty, I began to see something I had not seen before. My position in this family was not being removed in real time. It had already been redefined before I arrived. The confrontation was not the beginning of exclusion. It was the first time I was allowed to hear it spoken aloud. He talked about my father's words again, the way he had said them with such certainty that no one in the room questioned whether certainty itself required verification. She is the disgrace of this family. It was not a statement that invited discussion. It was a label that reorganized perception. And once perception is reorganized, memory begins to follow it. He looked back toward the hall again, watching the movement of people who were now carefully avoiding the center of the earlier tension, as if it had already been filed away into the category of resolved discomfort. My mother passed by the edge of my view at that moment, her eyes briefly scanning the hallway before settling somewhere else entirely. It was not avoidance. It was selection. She was choosing where to place her attention, and I was no longer included in that selection. He stood there for a while longer, the phone still in my hand, feeling the weight of something shifting that had nothing to do with emotion anymore. It had to do with structure. Who was allowed to define what had happened, and who was expected to accept that definition quietly. And then, as the noise of the wedding continued behind me like a distant wave, I understood that the message I had received was not changing what had just been said. It was changing what had actually been true the entire time. I remained in the quiet hallway longer than I intended, not because I was waiting for something to happen, but because I was trying to understand what had already happened without my participation. The wedding music continued faintly behind the closed doors, but even that sound felt detached now, like it belonged to a different version of the day that no longer included me. He held the phone in my hand loosely, the screen still lit, still showing the message that had disrupted everything I thought I understood. He read it again, not searching for new information, but searching for confirmation that my interpretation was not wrong. It was not wrong. It was simply incomplete in the way truth often is when it arrives without context. A door opened down the hall and I instinctively stepped slightly to the side, not hiding, just adjusting my position in space. My mother appeared briefly at the far end of the corridor. She was speaking softly to someone I could not see, her posture composed, her attention already committed elsewhere. She glanced in my direction for less than a second. It was not a look of anger. It was not even a look of disappointment. It was something more neutral, something closer to administrative acknowledgement, as if she had confirmed I was still physically present but no longer part of the active conversation. She turned away before I could interpret it further. That moment stayed with me longer than the earlier humiliation in the hall. Because public rejection is loud enough to process. Quiet reclassification is not. He walked slowly toward a side exit, not because I had decided to leave, but because I needed air that was not shaped by expectation. As I moved, I noticed how carefully the event continued without me. Guests adjusted their conversations. Laughter returned in smaller, safer bursts. The wedding did not stop. It simply redistributed its focus. And in that redistribution, I became less of an interruption and more of a memory that was already being rewritten in real time. He stepped outside into the cooler air near the side garden. The sound of the celebration was still present, but softened now, filtered through walls and distance. He finally lowered my phone and looked at it without reading the message again. He already knew what it said. The details were no longer the point. The point was timing. Whoever sent it did not inform me of something new. They exposed something that had been active long before I arrived. I leaned against the exterior wall of the venue, letting the contrast between inside and outside settle into me. Inside, I had been defined in one sentence, publicly and without ambiguity. Outside, I was undefined again, which felt strangely more honest. I thought about my father's voice, the way certainty had replaced explanation. She is the disgrace of this family. There had been no hesitation in it. That lack of hesitation was what made it effective. Not the emotion behind it, but the authority it assumed. And now, standing outside the room. When it had been spoken, I understood something I had not allowed myself to consider earlier. That sentence was not the beginning of my separation from them. It was the public activation of a decision that had already been shaped elsewhere, in quieter rooms, in earlier conversations I had not been invited into. My phone vibrated again briefly in my hand, but I did not look immediately. Instead, I watched the reflection of movement through the glass doors of the venue. People were still celebrating. The wedding continued. Life inside was adjusting itself back into coherence. And I realized that my absence would not interrupt that process. It would simply be incorporated into it. When I finally looked down again, I did not feel the need to react. The message no longer felt like a revelation. It felt like confirmation of a structure that had already been in place long before I was allowed to see it clearly. I stayed outside near the side of the venue longer than I expected, not because I was avoiding what was happening inside, but because I needed to understand how quickly a life can continue without acknowledging the person it used to include. Through the glass doors, I could still see movement, soft silhouettes of guests returning to their conversations, laughter rebuilding itself in careful layers as if nothing had fractured. The wedding was repairing itself in real time, not by addressing what had happened, but by moving past it. He remained still against the exterior wall, feeling the contrast between the warmth inside and the quiet air outside, and I began to notice something I had not noticed before. Events do not stop for emotional truth. They only adjust around it. My phone was still in my hand, but I was no longer reading the message. He already understood its function. It was not meant to inform me. It was meant to reposition me. I finally unlocked the screen again, not to reread the content, but to trace the structure behind it. Names, demean, references that connected in a way that contradicted what had been spoken publicly. It was not confusion. It was coordination. And that realization changed the weight of everything I had experienced earlier. He slowly lowered the phone and looked back through the glass doors. My father was visible again near the center of the hall, speaking to a small group of guests as if the earlier moment had been absorbed into background noise. His posture was unchanged. His certainty remained intact. That consistency was what made it unsettling. Because nothing about him suggested correction had ever been necessary. My mother appeared briefly beside him, adjusting something small in her appearance, then redirecting her attention to someone else nearby. It was a practiced return to normality, a return that required no explanation because none was expected. He watched them for a few seconds longer, not searching for emotion anymore, but for process. He wanted to understand how decisions like this became stable enough to survive contradiction. Sophia passed through my line of sight briefly, moving between groups of guests, her wedding continuing in motion around the absence that had been created earlier. No one had stopped the event. It had simply absorbed the disruption and redistributed attention elsewhere. He realized then that exclusion does not always require removal. Sometimes it only requires absorption into something larger that refuses to pause. He pushed myself gently away from the wall and walked a few steps along the side of the building, not toward the entrance and not away from it, but parallel to it, as if distance itself had become the only available form of clarity. The air outside was cooler now, and the sound of the celebration was softer, layered, indistinct. He opened the message again, not because I needed confirmation, but because I needed to understand its position in the sequence of events. It did not contradict what my father had said in the hall. It reframed it. And in that reframing, I could see that the story being presented publicly was not the complete structure. It was only the visible surface of a decision that had already been established elsewhere. He thought about the exact moment my father spoke those words. There had been no hesitation, no negotiation, only certainty delivered as if it required no supporting explanation. She is the disgrace of this family. The sentence had been absolute in tone, but now I understood that its absoluteness was its purpose. It was not designed to invite response. It was designed to finalize interpretation. He stood there for a long moment, holding the phone loosely, no longer feeling the need to react to it emotionally. Something inside me had shifted from reaction to observation. From participant to witness. And as I watched the wedding continue through the glass, I understood something that felt quieter than shock but more permanent than it. The version of me that had been spoken about inside that room was already complete in their minds long before I arrived. He had not been removed in that moment. He had simply been shown the place where I had already been positioned. I remained outside for a while longer, standing in the quiet space beside the venue where the sound of celebration arrived only in fragments. It no longer felt like I was near the event itself. It felt like I was near the echo of it, something already processed and continuing without my involvement. He finally put my phone away in my hand without locking it, not because I was finished with it, but because I had stopped expecting it to change anything further. The message had already done its work. It had not created confusion. It had created separation between what was said in public and what was true in private. That distinction now felt irreversible. He slowly stepped away from the wall and began walking along the side path of the building, not with urgency, but with a steady pace that did not require decision. The ground was slightly uneven beneath my feet, and I found myself paying attention to small physical details because they were easier to process than emotional ones. The further I walked from the entrance, the quieter the sound of the wedding became, until it blended into a distant background tone that no longer demanded attention. He stopped near a row of decorative trees lining the side of the venue and stood there for a moment, looking back at the building. Through the glass, I could still see movement, but it was now abstract rather than personal. People were no longer individuals I knew. They were shapes within a system that had already adjusted to my absence. He thought again about my father's words. Not because they hurt in a new way, but because I was beginning to understand their function more clearly. She is the disgrace of this family. It was not a spontaneous statement. It was structured. It was positioned in a way that allowed everyone else in the room to align around it without needing further explanation. That alignment was what made it effective. Not belief, but participation. He leaned slightly against one of the trees, letting my attention drift between the building and the message still saved on my phone. He opened it again, this time not to interpret, but to map. The information inside it did not contradict itself. It contradicted the narrative that had been publicly established. That meant both versions could not have been formed at the same time without intention. And intention meant design. He closed the phone slowly and let my hand fall to my side. The realization did not arrive as emotion. It arrived as structure becoming visible. Inside the venue, I could see my mother again near the entrance of the main hall, speaking briefly with someone who appeared to be a guest. Her posture was composed, her movements measured, as if the earlier moment had already been placed into a category that required no further engagement. He understood then that silence in this environment did not mean uncertainty. It meant agreement without announcement. I shifted my gaze slightly and saw Sophie further inside, still in motion, still part of the event's progression. The wedding had not paused for anything that had occurred. It had only incorporated it as background detail that no longer required attention. That realization changed how I understood everything I had experienced. He was not witnessing a disruption. He was witnessing a system that was capable of absorbing contradiction without breaking its surface. He began walking again slowly, this time toward the far edge of the venue grounds where the lighting was dimmer and fewer people passed. Each step felt less like departure and more like repositioning. Not away from something sudden, but away from something already completed. He stopped one final time and looked back at the building. The celebration continued without visible interruption. And in that continuity, I understood something that no longer required proof. The moment I was publicly named was not the beginning of my separation. It was the confirmation of a separation that had already been finalized somewhere I was not present to witness. I walked further away from the venue until the sound of the wedding became almost indistinguishable from the surrounding environment. At that distance, the event no longer felt like something I was excluded from. It felt like something I had already exited, even before I had consciously chosen to leave. He stopped near the edge of the parking area where a few cars were beginning to leave slowly, their headlights sweeping across the ground in soft arcs. Each movement outside the building continued with normal rhythm, unaffected by the internal shift that had taken place earlier. That contrast stayed with me more than anything else. Inside, a sentence had defined me. Outside, nothing had changed at all. He stood there for a moment, holding my phone loosely again, not opening it this time. The message no longer required repeated reading. It had already completed its function. What remained was not confusion, but alignment between what I had been told and what I had witnessed. The gap between them was no longer emotional. It was structural. He leaned lightly against the side of a parked car, not because I needed support, but because I needed stillness that matched my thoughts. My mind was no longer returning to the moment in the hall. It was moving beyond it, reorganizing earlier memories into a pattern I had not recognized before. Small conversations, brief hesitations, decisions made without explanation, all began to form a sequence that now felt connected rather than random. He understood that what had happened publicly was not an isolated declaration. It was the visible endpoint of a longer process that had already been in motion. The realization did not feel dramatic. It felt precise. He thought about my father again, not as he appeared in the moment of declaration, but as he had been in earlier interactions where certainty had slowly replaced discussion. That certainty had not emerged suddenly. It had been built gradually, reinforced by agreement that did not require my presence to form. My mother's behavior now made more sense in that framework as well. Her quiet positioning, her avoidance of direct engagement, her tendency to remain near but not within decisive moments. These were not reactions to a single event. They were consistent roles within a system that had already stabilized itself long before I arrived at the wedding. He began walking again, slowly along the outer edge of the venue grounds, where the lighting was dimmer and the noise was reduced to distant fragments. Each step felt less like escape and more like confirmation of something already completed. He stopped near a row of trees at the far end of the property and turned slightly back toward the building. From this distance, the wedding looked intact. There were no visible signs of disruption. Guests still moved between spaces. Conversations still continued. The structure of the event remained whole. That observation carried a clarity that replaced the need for emotional interpretation. What had changed was not the event itself, but my position within it. I checked my phone once more without unlocking it, then let my hand fall again to my side. I no longer needed to verify the message. I already understood its purpose within the larger pattern. It was not introducing new information. It was revealing the framework that had supported everything leading up to that moment. I stood there for a while longer, observing the building in silence. The wedding continued without interruption, and in that continuation I recognized something final. The moment I was labeled was not a disruption in the story. It was the point at which I was no longer required to be part of how the story was being constructed. I remained standing near the edge of the venue grounds for a long time, until the distance between me and the wedding became something measurable not by space, but by meaning. From where I stood, the building looked unchanged. Lights still moved behind the glass. Shadows still formed and dissolved in patterns of conversation and celebration. Nothing outside suggested that anything inside had fractured. That realization stayed with me because it clarified something I had not fully accepted earlier. Disruption is not always visible from the outside. I slowly began walking along the outer path of the property, not with direction, but with continuity. My steps were steady, unhurried, as if my body had already accepted a pace that no longer required urgency. I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was moving through what had already been decided. The message on my phone remained unread at that moment, but it no longer felt like something holding significance over me. It had already served its purpose. Not as information, but as alignment. It confirmed that what I had heard publicly and what existed privately were no longer the same narrative. I stopped near a low fence that separated the venue from an adjacent garden area. The air here was quieter, less structured, as if it belonged to a different version of the same evening. I leaned lightly against the fence and looked back toward the building again. I thought about the moment my father spoke. Not the words themselves anymore, but the certainty behind them. That certainty had not been spontaneous. It had been practiced, prepared, and delivered as if it required no support from context. She is the disgrace of this family. The sentence had not invited discussion. It had completed one. And in that completion, I understood something that had not been clear inside the hall. Public statements are often not designed to reveal truth. They are designed to finalize perception. He continued walking slowly along the perimeter, passing areas where staff were beginning to clear small details from the event setup. Chairs were being adjusted. Decorations were being secured. Everything was returning to order. That return to order was what struck me most. It did not erase what had happened. It simply made it compatible with continuation. He realized that this was how systems protect themselves. Not by stopping when contradiction appears, but by absorbing it and moving forward as if it had always belonged. He finally stopped again at a point where the lights from the venue were partially obscured by trees. From here, the building felt even more distant, not emotionally, but structurally. He checked my phone again, this time unlocking it slowly. He did not reread the message. I simply held it open, looking at the screen as if confirming that it still existed in the same form. It did. That was enough. He closed the phone and placed it back in my hand without urgency. My thoughts were no longer focused on what had been said about me. They were focused on how quickly that version of me had been accepted by everyone inside that room without resistance. That acceptance had not required proof. It had required agreement. And agreement, once established, becomes more stable than truth. I began walking again, leaving the venue entirely now, not in response to emotion, but in recognition of position. He was no longer part of the system that had defined the event inside. He was now outside it, observing its continuation without participation. And in that distance, I understood something that no longer needed confirmation. The sentence that had been spoken was not a rupture in my place within the family. It was the moment that made visible the place I had already been assigned long before I was told. I had already left the immediate perimeter of the venue by the time I stopped again, this time near a quieter stretch of road where the sound of the wedding was reduced to something distant and fragmented. It no longer felt like I was walking away from anything emotional. It felt like I was moving out of range of a system that no longer required my participation. The night air was steady, neutral, and it helped slow my thoughts into something more structured. I stood there for a moment without moving, not because I was uncertain, but because I was finally noticing how certainty itself had been constructed without me. I took my phone out again and unlocked it. The message was still there. I did not reread it in full this time. I already knew every detail it contained. What I was observing now was not the content, but the implication of how it had been introduced into my reality at that exact moment. It did not feel random. It felt placed. And placement implies coordination. I lowered the phone and looked down the empty road ahead of me. There were no cars passing at that moment, no visible movement that suggested urgency or interruption. Everything around me was still continuing at its own pace, unaffected by the internal shift I had experienced only minutes earlier. I began walking again, slowly, allowing my thoughts to settle into a pattern that was no longer reactive. I thought about my father's voice in the hall. Not the anger, not the phrasing, but the certainty. That certainty had been the most important part of the entire moment. Because certainty does not invite correction. It defines boundaries around interpretation. Once something is declared with enough authority, it no longer needs to be defended. It only needs to be accepted by those present. He realized that everyone in that room had accepted it without hesitation. My mother, my sister, even the guests who had briefly reacted and then returned to celebration. That acceptance was not passive. It was structural. It allowed the moment to become permanent without requiring ongoing attention. He stopped walking again and turned slightly toward the direction of the venue in the distance. From here, it was no longer visible directly, only implied by faint light against the sky. I thought about Sophia's wedding continuing inside that structure, continuing without interruption, as if nothing had permanently changed. That continuity was important. It showed me that systems do not stop when contradictions appear. They absorb them and proceed. I began to understand that what had happened to me was not a break in the system. It was a recalibration of where I belonged within it. Or more precisely, where I no longer belonged. He sat down briefly on a low stone edge near the roadside, not because I was tired, but because I needed to observe the weight of what I now understood without movement interfering with it. He opened my phone one more time, but only to look at the message header again. The sender's name, the timestamp, the timing relative to the moment of public declaration. Everything aligned too precisely to be accidental. He closed the phone again and placed it beside me. The realization did not feel emotional anymore. It felt factual. He had been positioned outside the family narrative before the words were spoken in the hall. The sentence had not created the separation. It had only made it visible to everyone else at the same time. He stood up slowly and looked once more down the road. There was nothing ahead that required urgency, and nothing behind that required return. And in that space between both directions, I understood something final and quiet. What I had experienced was not a moment of rejection. It was the moment I was informed that the separation had already been decided without my presence in the decision itself. I did not realize how far I had walked until the lights from the venue were no longer visible at all. The road ahead was quiet, interrupted only by occasional distant traffic that did not belong to anything I was part of at that point. The silence was no longer something surrounding me. It felt like something I had entered fully. He stopped walking and stood still in the middle of the sidewalk, letting the night air settle around me. There was no urgency left in my body, no expectation of interruption. The message on my phone was still there, but I no longer felt compelled to check it again. He already understood its meaning. Not in detail, but in structure. It had confirmed what I had begun to see earlier. That my presence inside the wedding had not been removed in the moment of public declaration. It had been removed long before that moment reached visibility. He slowly put the phone away in my pocket and looked down the empty road again. It felt different now, not because anything around me had changed, but because my interpretation of it had. He was no longer trying to understand what had happened inside the venue. He was now observing what it meant that it had already been decided without my participation. That distinction was what made everything feel final in a way that did not require further explanation. He began walking again, slower this time, not toward any specific destination, but away from the structure that had defined the earlier part of the evening. Each step felt less like departure and more like continuation of something that had already separated itself from me. He thought about my father again. Not as he had appeared in the moment of the declaration, but as he must have been in the moments leading up to it. Calm. Certain. Already aligned with a version of reality that did not include contradiction. That certainty had been the most important part of everything. Because certainty does not emerge in public moments. It is formed in private agreement before it ever becomes spoken. He thought about my mother as well, the way she had looked away rather than toward me, not in anger, but in alignment with something that did not require her voice to confirm it. And my sister, still inside the structure of her wedding, continuing forward within a narrative that no longer needed to pause for what had occurred earlier. That continuity was what revealed the truth most clearly. Nothing inside the venue had broken. It had simply adjusted its internal positioning to remove me from its center of relevance. He stopped again near a quiet intersection where the streetlight cast a steady glow onto the pavement. There were no people nearby. No sound that required interpretation. He stood there for a moment and realized that I was no longer waiting for clarification. The message, the sentence spoken aloud, the reactions inside the hall, all of it had already converged into a single understanding. The story had not changed in that moment. My access to it had. He took my phone out one last time, not to read the message, but to confirm its existence as something separate from emotion. It remained unchanged. The same words. The same timestamp. The same structure that had already revealed its purpose. He closed it again and placed it back into my pocket. The night felt still, but not empty. It felt resolved in a way that did not require participation. He began walking forward again, not because there was somewhere I needed to arrive, but because standing still no longer matched the state I was in behind me. The venue continued its celebration without interruption. Ahead of me, there was no clear destination. And in between those 2 points, I finally understood that what had taken place was not the beginning of separation. It was the moment I was made aware that separation had already been complete long before I was told it existed.